Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 92 called The Wolves from the North. In the last episode we heard how in 552 Justinian put together the largest Roman army in his entire reign, probably around 30,000 strong, and entrusted it to his court chamberlain Narses to advance into Italy and subjugate the Goths once and for all. It worked. The Goths were utterly defeated at the battles of Busta Gallorum and Mons Lactaris. 2 years later, Narses defeated the Franks at the Battle of Capua. This sounds impressive, and it was. But did it reflect a truly strong Roman Empire, one that resembled the empires of Trajan and Hadrian when the world trembled at just the mention of the Roman legions? In my opinion, the answer is a resounding no. Now, I know that this seems to contradict what I've said many times, that the new Roman army reborn to fight Attila in the 5th century was probably the best fighting machine on the planet. And I still think that. But what Justinian failed to do was to increase the size of the army so that it could defend Rome's extended borders. He wasn't an Aurelian or Diocletian, who not only reformed the army but increased it to defend the borders. Instead, I think Justinian was a short-term pragmatist who went from one crisis to the next, and more often than not, he found short-term solutions that were not sustainable. And one such example that we'll cover in this episode was the Danube front. Going back to the days of classical Rome, the Danube had always been one of the three most important frontiers for Rome alongside the Rhine and Mesopotamia. For example, in the 3rd century AD, the Emperor Decius had died fighting the Goths who broke through the Danube defences to plunder the Balkans. And by the 440s, Attila's empire made the Danube frontier critically important. To oppose Attila, the Eastern Roman army was expanded and reorganised so that it had 2 Pricental field armies added to its existing 3 field armies, 2 already in the Balkans, the Illyrian and Thracian, and 1 was on the Eastern Front. This meant that, in effect, 4 out of the 5 Roman field armies were defending the Danube. As discussed in previous episodes, we have no record of what happened to these field armies in Justinian's reign. However, it seems fairly certain that they were used to conquer North Africa and Italy. Justinian created a new military command structure mainly to reflect his conquests, so besides the existing field armies for Thrace, Illyria and the Oriens or the East, he added new ones for North Africa, Italy and Armenia. But what he didn't do was to increase the overall size of the army, so the old field armies were reduced to man the new ones. This meant the Danube frontier was left critically vulnerable, and this happened at the same time as a build-up of barbarian nations north of the Danube that would overwhelm Thrace and Illyria even in Justinian's own lifetime. To understand how this happened, we need to go back over half a century to the year 488, when the Ostrogoths left the Balkans for Italy, as discussed in episode 68. For many years, this stabilised the Balkans, with 2 German tribes coexisting north of the Danube, the Gepids to the east and the Lombards to the west, occupying roughly modern Hungary and western Romania. To the east of the Gepids, and still with a toehold on the Danube delta joining the Black Sea, were the remnants of Attila's Huns, forming 2 groupings, the Kutrigers and the Utigers. Procopius says these nations were led by 2 Hunnic kings, Kutriger and Utiger, hence their names. Yet another people, the Slavs, existed to the north of these, in Central Eastern Europe, that is, modern Poland and Ukraine. The Slavs comprised many small separate tribes, some of which were migrating south towards the Danube, where they became vassals of the Lombards and Gepids. With this web of barbarian tribes north of the Danube, Roman diplomacy under the Emperor Anastasius, and also continued by both Justin and Justinian, was simple: play the barbarians off against each other. Using bribes, the Romans allied first with the Gepids against the Lombards and the Kutrigas against the Utigas, and then reversed these when their allies became too powerful. This worked reasonably well, while there was also a Roman army guarding the Danube frontier. But when that army was reduced, trouble began. The first sign of this was in 539, when Justinian sent a significant detachment of troops from the Balkans to help Belisarius in Italy. The result was a large Kutriga raid across the Danube, as mentioned in episode 85. Procopius tells us this raid was devastating. The Kutrigas captured 32 fortified centres and carried home, reportedly, 120,000 prisoners. They even briefly crossed over to Asia Minor from the Chersonesus. This was like Attila's raids, albeit on a much smaller scale. But it was still shocking. What stands out like a sore thumb is that there was no Roman field army to oppose the Kutrigas. Although, unfortunately for this period, we have no detailed records about the Roman army similar to those of the 5th century Notitia Dignitatum, we can be fairly sure that most of it was in North Africa and Italy. The Persian sack of Antioch the following year in 540 shows the army was very weak in the east as well. The Kutriga raid of 539 stung Justinian into action, but not in the right direction. Instead of increasing the army so that it could defend the empire's extended frontiers, he merely tried harder to play his enemies off against each other. So he paid the other Hunnic group further east, the Utigas, to attack their cousins. This policy worked for a time, but it still left the Balkan provinces exposed to another enemy, the Slavs. We know very little about the origins of the Slavs, who would play a significant role in European history. In ancient times, they seem to have inhabited what we would call Central and Eastern Europe, i.e. modern Poland and Belorussia, on the northern and eastern edges of the vast area known as ancient Germania. It seems they migrated south towards the Danube when the Huns pushed the Germans out of this area. And that's exactly what happened in the early 530s, when Procopius tells us Justinian appointed an able general, Chilbudius, magister militum of the Thracian field army. At first, he defended the Danube frontier well, but in around 533, he was defeated and killed. The Slavs remained in the area north of the Danube and posed a continual threat to the Romans. Procopius described them comprising many tribes who lived a basic life, believing in a god of lightning to whom they made sacrifices. In battle, they were poorly equipped. Quote, "The majority of them go against their enemy on foot, carrying little shields and javelins in their hands, but they never wear breastplates." End quote. They lived in, quote, "pitiful hovels, but they were tall and strong." Quote, "They are all exceptionally tall and hardy men." End quote. The politics of the Slavs is obscure. Politically, the tribes were fragmented. Quote, "They live under a democracy, and consequently everything that involves their welfare, whether for good or ill, is a matter of common concern." End quote. They didn't have the centralised government of the German tribes or the Huns, and probably some tribes paid allegiance to the Gepids, Lombards, Kutrigas and Utigas, and may have served in their armies. However, worryingly for the Romans, it seems there was some consolidation among the tribes, so that by the late 540s, they were capable of making larger and more effective raids. For example, when Justinian was building up his army in Illyria to fight Totila in 549, Procopius says there was a significant raid of 3,000 Slavs, which may seem a relatively small number, but which the Romans found hard to contain. The Slavs avoided pitched battles and preferred ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. Germanus was told to crush them, but his unexpected death meant the Romans did little. According to Procopius, the Slavs pillaged far and wide in Thrace, Trickery was their speciality at the largest town they tried to take, Topyrus in Thrace. Procopius says they tricked the garrison into coming out of the town, thinking they were quite a small force, only to ambush them and take the town by storm, where they killed all the men and enslaved the women and children. According to Procopius, they were brutal in their treatment of captives and enjoyed impaling them. Quote, "They killed their victims not with sword or spear, not in any familiar way, but by planting stakes very firmly in the earth, having made them extremely sharp, and by impaling the poor wretches upon them with great force, drove the point of the stake between the buttocks and pushed it up into the intestines." End quote. Not even the Huns seem to have been as vicious. In 552, as Narses was defeating the Goths, the Slavs struck again. This time it may have been the Gepids who put them up to it, since Procopius tells us they charged the Slavs 1 gold coin per man to ferry them across the Danube. The Roman defences were again inadequate. It was only Justinian's offer to pay the Gepids that stopped the Slav incursions. I can't help thinking the Gepids had calculated they could double their money, first taking it from the Slavs and then from the Romans. But if the Slavs were making an unwelcome entry onto the Roman stage, even more significant events were taking place far away on the distant plains of Asia. In earlier episodes, we discussed how in the 4th century AD, a severe drought in Central Asia caused a group of Huns to migrate westwards towards Europe, putting pressure on the German tribes who, to escape from this fierce new enemy, invaded Roman territory. And thus began the fall of the Western Empire. So, in the 6th century, there was another critically important migration to Europe from Asia. This time it wasn't the Huns, but another group of steppe nomads called the Avars. The reason for their migration seems to have been the same as that which drove the Huns west: drought. Recent research by paleoclimatologists looking at millennia-old juniper tree ring records suggests that there was a severe drought on the Eastern Asian steppes after the Great Cooling Event of 536. This drove both the Avars and the Turks, the two main nomadic groups in Asia living around the Chinese borders, to migrate westwards. The Avars fled from the Turks, who seem to have gained the upper hand between the two groups. The first contact with Rome occurred in 558, when, according to the chronicler Menander Protector, who was another Greek lawyer like Procopius and Agathias, the Avars sent a delegation to Justinian saying, quote, "One Candic was chosen to be the first envoy of the Avars, and when he came to the palace, he told the Emperor Justinian of the arrival of the greatest and most powerful of the tribes. The Avars were invincible and could easily crush and destroy all who stood in their path. The Emperor should make an alliance with them and enjoy their efficient protection. But they would only be well disposed to the Roman state in exchange for the most valuable gifts, yearly payments, and very fertile lands to inhabit." End quote. Justinian's response was to pay the Avars tribute. According to Menander, unusually for him, he referred his proposal for an Avar alliance to the Senate in Constantinople. Perhaps he was aware of the growing resentment at the amount of money being paid to keep Rome's enemies quiet. But no senators were brave enough to voice their disapproval. We don't know the amount of tribute sent north, but it was probably substantial. In the short term, and for the rest of Justinian's lifetime, it worked. The Avars conveniently subjugated both the Utigars and Kutrigas in 562 and stopped them raiding Roman territory. The Kutriga raid of 559, which Belisarius had defeated, was never repeated. The Slavs and Gepids also fell under their control. Therefore, by the time of Justinian's death in 565, his alliance with the Avars appeared to be a stroke of genius. In fact, it was the exact opposite. Avar power grew and grew after his death. In 566 they defeated the easternmost Frankish king Sigebert. In 567, with Avar help, the Lombards defeated the Gepids, and the Lombard king Alboin made the skull of his Gepid counterpart King Cunimund into a drinking cup. So the Gepids were gone, and the Lombards didn't want to stick around either. Alboin knew it wouldn't be long before the Avars made his skull into a drinking cup. In 568, the Lombards left the middle Danube, and similar to the Ostrogoths 80 years before, they headed en masse to northern Italy. There they would shatter the frail Roman control of the region. Meanwhile, the Avars became the dominant power in the Balkans. When Justinian's successor, Justin II, cancelled the Avar tribute, his successor, Tiberius II, had to reinstate it pretty quickly. We'll cover this in future episodes, but suffice to say, Justinian's payment of tribute to the Avars may have worked in his lifetime, but he created a monster for his successors. Let's now turn our attention back to the Sasanians, who were also the recipients of Justinian's tribute. In episode 89, we left the Persian Shah Khosroes before the walls of Edessa in 543. He couldn't take the town, and its inhabitants paid him £500 of gold to go away. By this time, both the armies of Rome and Persia were weakened by the plague. Khosroes saw little more to gain in Mesopotamia now that Roman forces had been redirected there. So, in 545, he agreed to a 5-year truce with Justinian in exchange for £2,000 of gold and the loan of the physician Tribunus, who had allegedly saved Justinian from the plague. But 2 years later, Khosroes' attention returned to Laziga, which is modern Georgia in the Caucasus, where he'd secured the port of Petra as a window on the Black Sea, as we heard in a previous episode. His aim was to build a fleet, and perhaps to attack Constantinople itself. But, according to Procopius, the timber he assembled to build the ships was torched apparently by lightning, but more likely by sabotage. Khosroes' ambitions were also undermined by the logistical difficulties of supplying a Persian army in a mountainous and densely wooded region. In contrast, the Romans had much shorter supply lines and could invade with greater ease. The indigenous Lazzi supported the Romans, and the combined Roman-Lazzi forces defeated the Persians in 548 and 549 and put Petra under siege. Khosroes devoted enormous resources to fighting the Romans in this region, but he was always at a logistical disadvantage. In 551, the Roman general Bessas, one of Belisarius's former lieutenants and now in his 70s, besieged Petra. The Persian defenders fought back valiantly by, Procopius tells us, building wooden towers on top of the city's walls so that they could drop incendiary bombs onto the Roman battering rams. But one day the Persians were unlucky, and a high wind blew the incendiary bombs onto the wooden structures themselves, setting them alight. In the ensuing chaos, the Romans forced their way into the city. At last, Petra was back in Roman hands, and Khosroes' window on the Black Sea had been firmly shut. Khosroes made one last attempt to achieve his dream. In 556, according this time to Agathias, now that Procopius has put down his pen, a huge Persian army of 60,000 advanced into Lazica. But yet again, the Romans repelled it. A Roman Lazzi force, led by Martinus, another of Belisarius's former generals, prevented the Persians from advancing further than Phasis. The next year, Khosroes, now an old man and increasingly preoccupied with the appearance of the Avars on Persia's own northeastern frontiers, agreed a peace with the equally aged Justinian. But yet again, despite what was a Roman victory in Lazica over superior Persian forces, Justinian bought peace by paying tribute to Persia. In 557, Khosroes demanded £400 of gold per annum for 5 years. Justinian paid it up front, £2,000 of gold, apparently thinking a one-off payment looked less like tribute than annual payments. In 562, this was renewed as a peace for 50 years, yet again with the Romans paying £400 of gold a year. This time, the first 7 years were paid up front. In the last years of his reign, Justinian proclaimed he'd secured victory over both the barbarians from the north and the Persians. But I suggest this was a lie to disguise the fact he'd bought peace, not won it in battle. As Agathias tells us, he reduced the size of the army so it was completely inadequate to defend the borders. Quote, "The Roman armies had not in fact remained at the desired level attained by the earlier emperors, but had dwindled to a fraction of what they had been, and were no longer adequate to the requirements of a vast empire. And whereas there should have been a total effective fighting force of 645,000 men, the number had dropped during this period to barely 150,000. Some of these, moreover, were stationed in Italy, others in Africa, others in Spain, others in Lazica, and others still in Alexandria and Egyptian Thebes. There were also a few near the eastern frontier with Persia, not that any more were needed there owing to the rigorous observance of the peace treaty. Such, then, was the extent of the drastic reductions in the armed forces incurred through the negligence of the authorities." End quote. I suggest by paying both the Avars and Persians tribute instead of increasing the army and defeating them, Justinian gravely weakened the Roman Empire. As we'll hear in a future episode, in 626, Constantinople was faced with a combined siege by the Avars in the west and the Persians in the east. The origins of this catastrophe lie with Justinian. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. The next episode will be in a week's time, on the 15th of June. And I'd like to ask a favour. If you like the podcast, could you leave a review and or recommend it to a friend? That would be fantastic. The podcast is entirely free, requires no subscription, and doesn't even have adverts. And of course, do also check out my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes, to find books, maps, blogs, and a free ebook. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.